book has a few basic points to make. First, Biden was absolutely right to go big. If anything, his economic program needs to be even more radical. He should be even a more fervent advocate for working families on the pocketbook issues, even if he can't get most of his program enacted. And here the role model is Harry Truman in 1948, whose poll numbers were even worse than Biden's. But Truman went big. He went big on economics. He went big on race. He desegregated the armed forces by executive order. He sent Congress progressive legislation, knowing that the Republicans would not pass it, and then campaigned on that blockage. And the problem isn't Joe Manchin. The problem is the 50 Republicans in the Senate who block everything. I remember when I worked for Senator Proxmire in the 1970s, you could drive from Washington State to Pennsylvania and not pass through a single state that had a Republican senator. And even better, those Democrats were progressive Democrats. They were labor Democrats. And so if we were more with working people and elected more Democrats like that, Joe Manchin wouldn't matter. Second key point is that the Democrats' embrace of neoliberalism and their alliance with Wall Street, from Carter to Obama, especially Clinton, paved the road for Donald Trump. Roosevelt said when he accepted his party's nomination for the second time in 1936, speaking of bankers, "They hate me and I welcome their hatred." In 2009, Obama, speaking to a group of bankers asking for their support for a rather feeble reform program, said, "My administration is the only thing standing between you and the pitchforks." Well, Obama should have been with the pitchforks. And thanks to the long legacy of Roosevelt's help to working people, as late as the 1996 presidential election, if you looked at counties that were at least 85% white and below median income, those counties split just about evenly between Robert Dole, the Republican, and Bill Clinton, the Democrat. By the 2016 election, those same counties went 658 for Donald Trump and 2 for Hillary Clinton. And that is the result of not standing up for working people and thinking that you can go left on social issues and that makes it okay to go right on economic issues. On the contrary, you buy the credibility to be avant-garde on social issues by delivering for all people on economic issues. So Biden's reversal of the neoliberal detour of the Democrats all by itself makes him a great president. And much of the book's narrative is an appreciation of just how radical Roosevelt was and how long the half-life of the New Deal was. He demonstrated that we needed to have regulated capitalism. And for 25 years after Roosevelt died, the economy not only grew at a record rate, but it grew more equal. The famous graph that EPI keeps updating, showing the relationship between wages and productivity, which converge until the mid-70s and then start diverging, is the proof of that point. I think movements also have played a role in the 30s, in the 60s, and today. In the 30s, the labor movement pushed Roosevelt. In the 60s, the civil rights movement pushed LBJ. And interestingly, you can ask whether the more diffuse nature of social movements today is a strength or a weakness. I would argue that social movements need to be more proactive in pushing Biden to be his best self. The book also looks hard at the great scourge of progressivism, which of course is racism. Even Roosevelt had to make his terrible accommodation with white supremacy in order to get his New Deal enacted. It was a New Deal for white people. And LBJ's multiracial coalition succumbed to white backlash and the cynicism of Richard Nixon. Biden, by the same token, has to jockey between legitimate demands for radical reforms that are 400 years overdue and the Republican caricatures of critical race theory. I think on the whole, Biden has done that well. And I would add that for me, Biden's return to New Deal progressivism has been very affirming. I co-founded EPI. I also co-founded the American Prospect. And these are two institutions at the left edge of the possible. And it's very affirming to see these two institutions being taken seriously in the corridors of power. It's great to see EPI alums working for the President of the United States. The final point in the book, I think, is the most important one. There is a road to defeating Trump and Trumpism. If you do the standard analysis of political history, 2022 is going to be a terrible year. The first midterm after a new president is elected is typically a wipeout for his party. But this is not a typical year. First of all, we have a secret weapon in Donald Trump. And the more Donald Trump goes on the campaign trail endorsing crackpot candidates, the more he energizes Democrats and splits his own party. And then, of course, we have the leaked Supreme Court decision in Roe, and I hate to find anything remotely resembling a silver lining in that, but I think we all know that this is going to energize Democrats who have been in a somewhat defeatist mood lately. I looked at the poll numbers. If you look at contestable congressional districts, the polls show that 60% of the people in those districts favor retaining Roe, and only 29% favor overturning it. And so the comparison ought to be with 2018, when large numbers of progressives and moderates, appalled by Trump, seeing the 2018 election as the last firebreak before we descended into a second Trump term and fascism, got out the vote and organized. And Democrats picked up 41 seats net. And it was the biggest increase in turnout relative to the previous midterm, 2014, in the history of the American Republic. And most of that increase went to benefit Democrats. We had groups like Indivisible. We had lots of other groups that just spontaneously sprang up. We had the Women's March. That's the kind of activism that I hope we're going to start to see this summer. It's also easy to overstate how much Republican voter suppression is going to undermine Democrats. Most states, after all, still run fair elections. And I count at least 25 Republican House members who won by less than 25 points, less than 10 points last time, who are in states that did not enact voter suppression. Those seats are gettable. You know, there are very few swing voters, but there are lots of swing districts. And which way those districts swing depends entirely on turnout. Last point, this is not a love letter to Joe Biden. The man doesn't walk on water. He's better than a lot of us expected. In a weird way, you kind of have the Sanders-Warren program in the persona of Joe Biden. And so it's incumbent on progressives to keep pushing himself to go big and to go bold. That's what you do at EPI. That's what we do at the Prospect. But I guess my final word is, for God's sake, let's not give up hope. Let's not succumb to defeatism. We don't have the luxury of it. And so the motto for this summer and fall should be, don't mourn, organize. Thank you.
Thank you. So a lot on the table for us to discuss today. And there are a few points that you made that I would love to go a little deeper on. First, I will start with the issue of race and racism in America. You mentioned the productivity pay gap chart that EPI is famous for. And one version of that chart actually breaks down the growth in wages by race and ethnicity. And while there's a wedge for every group, the magnitude of that wedge is not the same for all groups. Since the founding of this nation, race has been a deciding or dividing factor in American politics. And you mentioned some of the terrible compromises that FDR made with racist legislators to win enactment of the New Deal programs. But you also contrast that with the idea that Biden needs to achieve durable, and I think that term durable is a key phrase there, durable multiracial coalitions to build the support necessary to make big changes. And I would add to that, big changes, including the systemic and structural changes to advance racial equity and, in fact, advance gender justice in light of recent news. So I want to ask you, why do you think Biden's path to going big is different from FDR's? Compromise is always a possibility. Based on the lessons that we can learn from FDR, what's at stake by compromising, and what are some of the opportunities and challenges that Biden faces for building durable multiracial coalitions?
Well, in the first point, the difference between Biden and FDR, when FDR was president, the racists were in the Democratic Party, and they were Southern Democrats who controlled all the key committees. And the Republican Party was still the party of Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt, and they were racial progressives. So since then, the Republicans have stepped into the role of white supremacist party, and there really are hardly any Democrats who are not racial progressives. So in that sense, although Biden faces opponents in his own party, like Manchin and Sinema, for some of his social programs, he doesn't really face opposition on racial justice. And also, despite voter suppression, a lot more African Americans vote now than was the case in the 1930s. And so if you're going to build a majority coalition, it absolutely has to be a multiracial coalition. And I think the other thing Biden has really done well is, if you look at his appointments, he's just appointed superb people. He's appointed a more diverse senior cabinet and staff than any president in American history. And that reflects how serious he is about racial justice. That doesn't make the task easy, especially when Republicans are just going to the lunatic edge in caricaturing what is really just standard American history as some kind of far out brainwashing of America's children. And that's a disgrace. And if you recall, I hope everybody watched the short video of the courageous state senator in Michigan just calling out hatred. The way you defeat this is to call it out and remind people that Republicans are trying to generate hatred because they know that if we ever have a campaign based on the issues, people are not with the Republicans on the real issues.
Yeah. So I want to talk a bit now about the divisiveness that has become such a part of American politics. And as you mentioned, just the outright insanity in terms of the arguments and points that often get made. The nation's first president, George Washington, in what we now call his 1796 farewell address, warned against political parties, the danger of political parties and partisanship, in saying that the spirit of party, quote, serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. Now, in light of the 2020 election and the events of January 6th, I mean, we now see that as an incredibly prescient statement for him to have made so long ago. No one can deny the extreme partisanship that plagues our current political system, but you add another dimension to that in talking about the role of predatory capitalism and how that has complicated the identities of the parties and in fact splintered the Democratic Party in some sense. You talk about the alliance of Democratic presidents with Wall Street and how that has distanced the Democratic Party from what you call its natural constituency of working families, and how that really motivated the faux populism and neo-fascism of Donald Trump. What do you think today is the bigger threat to progressive economic agenda? Is it opposition from Republicans or the Republican message? Or is a bigger threat really addressing differences or watering down, if you will, of the Democratic Party on progressive issues?
Well, let me start out by commenting on Washington's famous warning against the divisiveness of faction and party in his farewell address. You know, really until the 1990s, until maybe Newt Gingrich, both parties were willing to play by the same basic rules. And then Republicans began attacking democracy itself. And particularly on the racial justice front, even though the Voting Rights Act kept being renewed, every time a Republican president took office, the Justice Department would weigh in on the wrong side. And so the consensus on voting rights erodes during the same period. And it's not a symmetrical extreme partisanship, even though some commentators would depict it that way. It's Republicans defecting from defense of basic democratic principles. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind. Democrats are trying to be the normal political party that have their views on a whole range of issues, and Republicans are trying to destroy democracy itself. So that's not a symmetrical extreme reversion to partisanship. Now, on the question of regulating capitalism and Democrats switching sides on that, you have this bizarre situation where a lot of the Trumpers feel that they're getting the short end of the stick, but because Trump racializes that, they forgive Trump for getting into bed with the corporations. Democrats, meanwhile, beginning with Carter, especially Clinton, to some extent Obama, get into bed with Wall Street. Bob Rubin is the kind of exemplar of this, and he wielded a tremendous amount of power within the Democratic administration, two administrations, over 4 decades. And if the main proposition of the Democratic Party is that we are the defender of working people, and we are the defender of multiracial coalitions, and you stop defending working people, and working people start wondering about whether the Democrats' proposition that activist government can help ordinary families has any meaning to it, then working families start being attracted by other issues like nationalism or even racism. And when the Democrats went in that direction, they departed from the Roosevelt legacy, and it was only a matter of time before Trump or someone like Trump would fill that vacuum. And it's a long road back. But Biden, to his great credit, has started us down that road.
So I want to remind our audience, if you have questions, please enter them using the Q&A function. As we approach the time that we will open the floor for questions, I want to encourage you, as you mentioned starting out, that we want to have some sense of hope, or that the 2022 midterms will not be an all-out wipeout for the Democratic Party. So I'm going to invite you to end us, or in our part of the discussion at least, on a positive note, and ask you specifically, what hope is there? What hope do you have that Biden's presidency can reverse the hyper-concentration of capital and the steady weakening of labor? What opportunities are there in building these multiracial coalitions and in other steps that the president may have already started to put in place for really re-energizing a progressive economic agenda for this country?
Well, I think even though some of his program is stymied in Congress, Biden has a lot of executive power. And one question that he's going to have to decide very soon, I hope he goes big on it, is relieving student debt. If you want to talk about race, African Americans are particularly disadvantaged. They're hobbled by debt. They tend not to have wealthy families that can pay tuition, so they incur debt. They're more likely to be targeted by predatory for-profit universities. They're more likely to have to not be able to complete college, and then they end up with a debt without the degree. But a lot of white kids who don't have wealthy parents are in the same boat. And so and he has the power to do that by executive order. He also has the power to strengthen what the Labor Department does to go after wage theft and misclassification. He also has the power to instruct the Department of Transportation to crack down on the airlines, which have been price gouging. I mean, if you want to talk about inflation, airfares are up 40% this year. Only a small fraction of that is more costly aviation fuel. He has the power to crack down on price gouging on the part of the drug companies. So And all of these afflict ordinary white families as well as ordinary and working class families of all races. So he could be doing more, he could be going bigger and bolder. And that, I think, would energize people to get out and work this summer and fall to make sure that the Democrats don't lose Congress.
All right, so with that, we have several questions from the audience that I will ask at this point. Okay, so the first question has to do with the issue of voting rights. And you talked about the history of the erosion of voting rights, that this isn't really a new thing. It's something that's been ongoing. So the question is quite simply, what do we do about the Republican efforts to diminish voting rights?
The problem is that if you don't have the courts on your side and you don't have the votes in Congress to extend voting rights and strengthen voting rights by legislation, all you can really do is use mobilization to offset suppression. You can litigate in some courts and hope that you can delay the effectiveness of some of these suppression efforts. But I wrote a piece on the issue of whether mobilization can defeat suppression. And I also urge everybody to keep in mind that in something like half of the country, if not more, you don't have voter suppression. And those are states where we can elect progressives if we can have a decent turnout.
So the second question we have here is about this idea of going big. And the fact that, historically, and I'll add this sort of comment just from my own expertise, over long periods of time, we tend to see much smaller changes in terms of economic equality between different racial and ethnic groups than even we see on more social indicators. For example, we've seen much larger shifts or changes in educational attainment than we see either in income inequality, wealth inequality, wage inequality, unemployment disparities. So those economic changes for Black and Brown communities historically have been incredibly slow to change and difficult to change. So this question asks, what needs to be done to change a dynamic that I just referenced that only got worse during the pandemic? Is the idea or the concept of going big that you write about in your book adequate to address those issues?
It's never adequate. We always need to go bigger. But as an example of something Biden did that went big, that helped everybody, but helped people of color disproportionately, the child tax credit, one of the biggest improvements to social policy since Roosevelt, and cut the child poverty rate, as you know, almost in half. And I think some of us were hopeful that once this was in place, it would be very difficult not to extend, but we hadn't reckoned on Joe Manchin. And I think that's something where Biden and other Democrats should go on the campaign trail and say, vote for us and we will make the child tax credit permanent. That was the kind of thing Truman did. If we could get a few more Democrats in the Senate, we could make the child tax credit permanent. And so, there's this debate about, do you have targeted programs or do you have racially neutral programs that disproportionately help African Americans and other people of color? And I think the answer is you do both. There's still very much of a role for affirmative action, but there's also a role for non-racially targeted programs that help everybody, that build support for social spending, but that disproportionately help Black kids because Black kids are disproportionately poor, like the child tax credit, and that builds interracial solidarity. So that's an example of going big, but we need to go even bigger, and we need to elect more progressives so that we can go bigger.
So this next question sort of builds or is an extension of the last, and talking about race and economic outcomes. In particular, the use of race to really divide and splinter people on economic issues where, according to the data and the factual evidence, they should be much more closely aligned. And so this viewer asks, how do we discuss a progressive economic agenda, one that will help people of color without pushing more people, and I assume more white people, into the Trump camp?
I think you talk about strategies and programs that benefit everybody, which by their nature, if you're helping to deal with poverty, if you're creating avenues of upward mobility, if you are relieving people of debt, because African Americans and other people of color are disproportionately disadvantaged in this society, you disproportionately help them, but you don't only help them. And that said, there's still a role, and I hope the Supreme Court doesn't overturn this as well. You know, there's still a role for affirmative action because we have 400 years of systemic racism to overcome. So I think it's both and. You build support for multiracial coalition by having programs that are non-racial, and then that buys you the space to have some racially targeted programs where that's necessary.
So I'll combine these next two questions here. So some working Americans actually think Republicans are the party of workers. And you spoke about this a bit earlier, but I'll give you a chance here to elaborate on that a bit. The question is, what happened and how do we counter that narrative? And I think maybe a related question to that is, what specific steps or actions should Democrats take to win back? This question says rural voters, but we may also, call that, when you said swing districts or swing voters.
Well, I think if you lose voters whose personal situation has gotten worse over the past generation, if you lose them on the pocketbook issues, you're just not going to get them back. And even though Republicans try to masquerade the fact that they're the corporate party by professing to be the party of white working people and dressing that up in nationalistic and racist jargon, when you push on it, time after time after time, they're the party of corporations. And so the more you can differentiate Democrats as the party of working people of all races and remind Republicans that they are trying to sell hate, to deflect attention from the fact that they're the party of corporations, then you have a chance to win back working people. And again, there was a time when Democrats won rural states. You had Democrats throughout the Midwest, the upper Midwest, the Rocky Mountain states, even the Southwest, rural states, but rural people voted for Democrats because Democrats delivered for them. And times were good, but times were good in part because capital was well regulated and unions were strong. And the only way Democrats can recoup is to get that back, or at least to stand for getting that back. And, that's why people like a Sherrod Brown get elected in a state like Ohio that mostly elects Republicans, because working people know that Sherrod Brown is with them. And Sherrod Brown is not any less progressive on all the racial justice issues, on the LGBT issues, on the other social issues, but because he is totally credible on the pocketbook issues, white working class voters still support him. So there's the recipe, and there's the personal proof that it can be done. And we've got a very interesting election today in Ohio, where we've got a fake populist, J.D. Vance, against a real populist, Tim Ryan, if Vance wins the nomination. Now, Trump has been such a bull in a china shop in wading into the Republican primary, where he endorsed Vance, that Vance may or may not win. That will be interesting too, if Trump does useful damage. My prediction is that Trump will do a lot of useful damage as he wades into all of these Republican primaries and endorses losers. But if the general election turns out to be Vance versus Ryan, we'll have a test of the proposition of whether real pocketbook populism can defeat fake populism.
So I think another thing that has probably changed quite a bit since FDR was president is the increased globalization of the economy. So this next question asks, what can the Democrats do to restructure globalized trade to benefit all working people?
One of my favorite questions. So as you mentioned in your introduction, I wrote a book in 2018 called Can Democracy Survive Global Capitalism? And since the 1980s, hyperglobalization has been used as a battering ram to undermine the ability of governments to regulate capitalism. And so you have the creation of something called trade in financial services, otherwise known as banking. And banking regulation is defined as an interference with trade. You have NAFTA, creating kangaroo courts in which corporations can sue on the ground that ordinary labor, health, safety, and environmental regulation somehow interferes with their right to trade. And you have case after case after case where globalization is used to undermine the ability to regulate capital. Well, Trump began to reverse this, but in a way that was xenophobic and racist. It was anti-Chinese people rather than anti-Chinese mercantilist economic policy. Biden is doing this without the racism. Catherine Tai, the US trade rep, is just terrific, one of Biden's best appointees. And so now we have a policy that limits China's ability to send subsidized products, products that price below market, products that are based on theft of intellectual property into the United States. And then we are using this change in our China policy to have industrial policies, to reshore and rebuild American production here at home. And that's an example of how the kind of hyper-globalization that was embraced by both parties. Bill Clinton, shame on him, was the champion of hyper-globalization in the WTO. Biden is reversing that. And so by having industrial policies, by not making industrial policy a kind of a dirty word, and building industry the way we have done since Alexander Hamilton in this country with government help, you start again putting government on the side of working people and not on the side of multinational corporations.
So again, we have a couple questions here that are related on the topic of inflation. And I'll add a bit in this as well. Corporations are profiting from the pandemic and raising prices. They're blaming worker wages and people believe them. And I'll add that there are even those who suggest that our pandemic policy response and the CARES Act and ARPA sort of spurred some of this increased inflation as well. So the question, can Biden and the progressives do anything to counter these ideas and these narratives?
Yeah. And the problem here is that if people are feeling that their own economic situation is worsening, they tend to blame the president in power. And, if you think about Roosevelt's fireside chats, Roosevelt was a terrific explainer. He was wonderful at explaining in terms that ordinary people can understand how the economy worked. And in fact, if you look at what is driving inflation, it's one big part, the supply chain crisis. And where did the supply chain crisis come from? Well, it came from neoliberalism. We deregulated all these industries, and then the wise guys from the business schools came up with the idea of just-in-time production. You keep low inventories, and you have far-flung supply chains, and that way you lower the cost of industry, and you can get your inputs just in time. And of course, the people who came up with this theory left one factor out, and that was the possibility of disruption. And so once you have disruption of the kind that we had beginning with the pandemic, you don't have access to supply, and old-fashioned supply and demand kicks in, and prices go up because supplies are scarce. Now, that has nothing whatsoever to do with CARES or with ARPA or with Biden spending on child tax credit. But it's very easy for Republicans to perpetrate this myth. And the second point, which the questioner raises, which is equally important, corporations take a free ride on the premise that, well, prices are going up, and so I might as well price gouge. And you have this in industry after industry after industry. And Biden needs to take it to those industries and stand in the way of that. Now, he's done it by reactivating antitrust. He could do it by having his transportation department go after the airlines and just making it as clear as he possibly can where most of these price increases are coming from. And that's the president as teacher in chief. Sometimes he's good at this, sometimes he's not so good at this, but I think he could be making more of an effort to explain where the inflation is really coming from. And by the way, you mentioned workers. I mean, wages are going up, but wages are lagging behind inflation in most sectors. EPI has done terrific work on this. And if listeners, watchers want to learn more on this, go to epi.org and you'll find chapter and verse. In a few sectors, like some of the service sector, where it's hard to get people to work for paltry wages, wages have gone up. But in most sectors of the economy, wages are still lagging behind inflation. And if wages are lagging behind inflation, how can you possibly tell a story of inflation being driven by wage increases?
Yeah, and I'll add it, in those sectors where we have seen growth, those are sectors where people did not experience any wage growth for many years. So any growth that they have experienced in the last few years is really just catching up to what they didn't earn in previous years. So Build Back Better was, touted as the signature policy agenda of the Biden administration. Are there any potentially salvageable parts of Build Back Better? The question asked in this congressional session, but I will expand that to say in the remainder of the Biden administration at all.
Yes, I think there are. I would lead with the child tax credit. I would lead with more support for childcare and pre-K. These are popular. These are even popular in Joe Manchin's West Virginia. I would also add support for universal broadband, which is good industrial policy. I would add some of the other industrial policies, like the $50 billion for reclaiming American leadership in semiconductors. And, Manchin kept pulling bait and switches. I mean, he kept bargaining in bad faith. He kept sitting down with Biden and saying, well, if you do this and do that, I'll give you half a loaf. And then he said, well, actually, I'm only going to give you a quarter loaf. And Biden went the last mile with Manchin. Manchin kept pulling out the rug from under him. So I'm actually optimistic about the Senate, because if you do this state by state, we can pick up seats in Pennsylvania. We can pick up a seat in Wisconsin. We may be able to pick up a seat in North Carolina. And we can hold seats that are going to be very close in Georgia and Nevada and Arizona and New Hampshire. And if we can get one or two more seats in the Senate, Joe Biden can bay at the moon, and it doesn't matter. And this has always been the case with the Democratic Party. I mean, Lyndon Johnson had to pass civil rights over the opposition of racist Democrats. And Roosevelt had to pass some of the New Deal over the opposition of conservative Democrats. So there's nothing wrong with Joe Biden that a couple of more votes in the Senate wouldn't cure. And the Senate is actually looking pretty good. In Georgia, where, it's going to be a very close race, Trump has done us a great favor by endorsing Herschel Walker, who one day of the week is in trouble for a fake resume. Another day, the next day of the week, he's in trouble for alleged sexual assault. And, Warnock faces a rough race, but he's got a beatable opponent In Walker, oops, this is supposed to be off. It's now off. I don't want to seem naively hopeful, but again, despair is a luxury that we cannot afford.
So what about pushing for a higher minimum wage? Is that a lost battle?
No, and I think again, because of Biden's authority over federal contracting, he could have even a higher minimum wage for federal contractors. Don't forget, long before we had the votes to pass the '64 Civil Rights Act, prohibiting discrimination in employment, we had executive orders. We had executive orders beginning with Roosevelt's executive order, 8802, that was his compromise with A. Philip Randolph, that headed off Randolph's threatened march on Washington during the wartime buildup. And that was an order of prohibiting discrimination in defense contracting. This is 1940. And then in 1961, when Kennedy did not have the votes to pass the Civil Rights Act, Kennedy issued an executive order requiring federal contractors to take affirmative action to recruit and hire African Americans. This was the first use of the term affirmative action. That's where the concept was invented. So president has a lot of power through executive orders on race, on economic justice, and Biden could be doing more with this.
So we know the United States is not the only democracy or the only capitalist economy in the world. Do you see any recent role models in other countries that could provide a template for a shift back toward progressivism in the US?
Well, of course, Scandinavia is always invoked as Exhibit A. And the Scandinavian countries have much stronger trade unions. They have much more equal wage and salary structures. They have family leave programs to die for. And conservatives don't dare get rid of these programs because they're popular. You know, if you reach a certain critical mass with social programs that benefit regular people, then even conservatives are forced to accept them. France has the world's best program of early childhood. You've got a sliding scale, so-called crèche maternelle, pre-K for kids as young as 6 months. In those pre-Ks, the teachers, rather than getting the paltry wages that many pre-K workers get in the United States, those teachers are better paid than primary school teachers because they are required to take extra courses in child development and in public health. And nobody dares oppose this. The conservatives support it, the progressives support it, the centrists like Emmanuel Macron support it. So I think Social Security is the best model here. If you get a program that is sufficiently broad that everybody benefits from, and it's just part of the furniture, it's part of what you grow up with, then it's very well barricaded politically. And we just need more of those programs.
So I'm trying to see what to fill in next here. So there are a couple questions here about misinformation that we know is a huge part of this and a huge part of politics and economic policy and helping to communicate a message about what will be good and what will be best for working families. So we know that there are news outlets that traffic, especially in misinformation, but also in terms of really building what you call pocketbook populism, or at least what the person raising this question uses that term. Real pocketbook populism is, threatened by the fact that there's so much misinformation out there about what's actually best for working families, and people are confused on what to believe, and you throw in nationalism and racist ideology in there, and I think that further dilutes or distracts people from the message. Is there a way really to push back effectively on a wide scale against misinformation, or how could we go about sparking the real pocketbook populism, to use the phrase that's specifically in this question?
Yeah, well, you do it with words and you do it with deeds. So you at EPI do it with research by putting out accurate information. We at the Prospect do it with information and argument by putting out accurate information. But I think you also do it with deeds. So if your family gets a check every month from the government, $2,500 per child, $3,000 if the child is under 6 years, and there it is, it's a check, it's like a Social Security check. How do you put out information that's misinformation about that? There's the check. It's in your bank account. And by sponsoring easy to grasp policies that provide real help to real people, it's kind of hard to lie about what you're going on, about what's going on. So, then the right reverts to kind of cultural misinformation. And I think there, the kind of indignation that we heard from the state senator from Michigan saying, we are just not going to allow hatred to win out, and reminding people that this misinformation is put out to divert attention from the real issues, and reminding people why the Republicans do this, because if the debate is about the real issues, they can't win. So they need to contrive phony issues. And, one hopes that the truth will win out, but that's not always guaranteed. There's an old saying, a lie is halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on. And those of us who traffic in real information, like EPI, like the American Prospect, we do nuances. We're careful about our footnotes. We like to be accurate. If you're making stuff up as you go along and coming up with any wild, fantastical story, you don't have to be hobbled by facts.
Yeah, and unfortunately, if you can communicate something with enough emotion, then facts sort of go out the window, unfortunately. We have time now, I think, for one final question, and I want to give you a few seconds or a quick minute or two to just sort of sum things up with the last thought. But this last question asks about the increased movement among workers to fight for unions. What do you see? Where do you see this going? How can workers fight corporations that have so much power today? Well,
we certainly see it in the Starbucks organizing. We see it in the Amazon organizing, although they lost one yesterday. It's very, very tough. It helps to have a labor department and an NLRB that at least is committed to a level playing field in fair elections, which we finally have now under Biden. So that can help. We did a profile in our current issue of the general counsel of the NLRB and all the creative effort that she's putting into leveling the playing field for unions. It helps when the president, Biden, basically says what goes even beyond what Roosevelt said, where he literally says, if I were a worker, I'd join a union. And unions now have about a 60% approval rating, the highest in half a century. 60% of Americans who are not members of unions say they would like to join a union. And the only reason they don't is because they don't have the opportunity or they're afraid they'd be fired. So it's tough. I mean, corporations have the power. Corporations hire these union busting law firms. They play all these games. And yet workers keep rediscovering the value of unions. And it does help to have the government either be at least benignly neutral or to be on the side of the workers' right to organize.
Well, this has been a great discussion. Thank you so much, Bob, for sharing your time with us this afternoon. I do want to give you an opportunity to close things out with any final thoughts or comments about the book or anything else that you'd like to close us out on.
Well, I just want to repeat that despair is not an option, and it's too easy to say, Biden isn't everything I hoped he'd be, and he's kind of tired, and I wish he'd do X, wish he'd do Y, and we're going to get clobbered, so why bother? I mean, given the stakes in this election, given the fact that 2022 is a run-up to 2024, And if Trump, God forbid, were to be reelected in 2024, and I'm an optimist, I honestly think if that were to happen, we could really kiss democracy goodbye. 4 more years, he can wreck what's left of American democracy. So this fall's election is crucially important. And even if you're feeling a little bit down, despair is a luxury you do not have. Look at the people in the Ukraine. Look at the people in the civil rights movement of the 60s or in Lincoln's time. Look at what they endured, and go out and organize. And let's get out the vote, and let's prevent the Republicans from just rolling over this democracy.
Well, thank you. That is an excellent way to end today's webinar. I want to thank everyone who joined us. Thank you for all the excellent questions. If you would like more information on the book, or would like to connect with a link for the recording of this video, you can visit www.epi.org.
And I forgot to add the most important thing, which is buy the book.
And buy the book. And follow at Economic Policy on Twitter or all social media.
Thanks so much for hosting this and for having me. This was great.
Thank you.